All right, welcome to another video here in the Turner Made series. This time, we're going to be taking a look at an issue that I've noticed in a couple of models that I've been looking at, that I've been reviewing, that come from former students and students alike. This is a problem when people don't fully understand texturing and the process of texturing, and so I wanted to go through this with you. The problem has to do with what's called Texel Density. Now, I've gone and put together a tiny little scene here, incorrectly, I might add, in order to show you the problem with Texel Density and why we want to make sure that we get this part of texturing correct. So what I've got here inside of Max are two meshes that I've just very quickly gone and put together. I've got this lovely Persian rug, and then sitting here in the middle of the Persian rug is a can of Coke. So, what is the problem with what we see? I mean, everything kind of looks really nicely textured, or at least mediocre. I did this in about 2 minutes here. I wasn't actually looking to get a game quality asset built, but just the point of texturing, I've got only a diffuse color or a base color on these two objects here. But what is the problem with this? Well, the problem has to do with the resolution of the textures, the textile density. So if I go and zoom in on the can here, we'll see that we can actually read a good chunk of the writing on the can, and you can see what happens when up close to the can like this. You can see what happens to the rug and the texture of the rug. So what we're seeing here is a mismatch in quality. We're seeing textile density that is not unified. So here, the rug's texture is blown out and pixelated, and the texture on the can is now crystal clear and not pixelated. In fact, I can zoom in quite a bit on this thing before we reach the level of pixelation. Now, when you're playing around with textile density and you're unwrapping your meshes, getting to the point that things look good and unified is really, really important. The last thing you want to have when you're working on a game is an asset that is crystal clear but takes up a very small amount of screen size versus an asset that's really big and blurry that takes up a larger percentage of the screen space. So to kind of show you what I mean here, I'm going to show you two images, and we'll kind of talk about these two images. So first, we're going to take a look at a screenshot here from Call of Duty Black Ops. So let's say that you were texturing something like the soda can, and it was meant to be in a game like this. Now, not only just in a game like this, this is not just first person versus not first person. But what I mean here is, let's say that in this game, one of the things that your player could do would be have the ability to grab a can of Coke. So when you look at this, you can see, I'm just going to turn on Epic Pen here and draw a couple of things for you. So if we were to kind of analyze how big a can of Coke would be when being held in this game, it's going to be, in relation to the hands, a very, predictable size. We know roughly how big a can of Coke should be. So I'm just going to move this guy over here, and we'll ignore that update for now. So if I were to go and draw, a can of Coke that's going to fit in this guy's hand, it would be something about that size there. I'm just kind of predicting, the shape here based off how big this dude's hand is. So that's about how big a can of Coke would be in a first-person shooter if it was an asset that the actual first-person hands could hold. Now, if we analyze the screen here, we know that this is across here 1920 by 1080. So that's going to go down this way at 1080. So when you do that kind of math, we can start to analyze when this, can of Coke is on screen, the largest amount of screen space that it takes up, if we block that 1920 in half, we'll get, what is that? 19 is going to be 960 for half the screen. And you can see that half the screen, from here to here, that distance is, still much larger than the can of Coke. So if we drop that in half even further, we're going to get 480. And so that would be half the screen. This size is 480. After that, if we split it again, we're going to get 240. And that is now, in relations to the width of this can, that's now something a little bit closer to the right size. You can see this distance and this distance are really close together. So this can only ever occupies, at least in width, about 240 pixels. This is a pretty good indication as to how large a texture you should put on this thing. 8192 is ridiculous. That's well larger than the resolution of the entire screen. 4096, again, that's 4 times the resolution of the screen. 2048, now we're just barely above the resolution of the screen. And 1024 is now actually giving us something only just slightly smaller than the width of the screen. We're actually only just slightly smaller than the height of the screen. When we actually get into the size of the can here, this 240, it means that we could probably use a texture resolution of 256. And again, that'll work for left to right of the can, but you got to remember that this is going to get unwrapped and opened up. So probably 512 here would work for something that is, in terms of a first-person shooter, being an object that you can hold. There's no reason to actually go any larger than this if that object can't occupy any more of the space. Now, there are exceptions to this. You got to bank into account animation and what the player can do that. Obviously, if they were holding a can of Coke, they might be able to hold it up like this. You get your pull tab up here like this, and there's your big spout down here, so that they actually take a drink. If that was what you were able to do, and there's a Coke simulator. In that case, obviously everything changes. It's now getting a lot closer to the camera. But it's a little bit of an indication. Now, if we compare that, and again, that's just one scenario, here's The Last of Us. And if you were now to go and picture a can of Coke, and again, I'm going to zoom in on this image here to try and make it a little bit more full screen. I don't want to... There we go. Let's try that. So about there. So if you were to look at the Last of Us full screen, a can of Coke here is going to be about that big. Just basing it on Joel and how big Joel is. That's how big it's going to get here. And again, that's only when you're as close to it as you can get. So again, we do our 1920, and we divide, and we divide, and we divide, and we divide. And like now, I'm down here to like a 16th of the screen, and I'm only, now getting close to the size of that can. So that's something we need to take into account when we texture things, making sure that you're not just blowing out your texture memory because it looks good. And again, this is something that's really, really easy to do when you're modeling. I too often fall prey to this when modeling, that, I want to, when I'm looking at things, make sure that, up close, oh, look at this can I modeled. It looks so good and crisp and clean. But look at how big this is on my screen. It's larger than you'll ever see this asset properly in a game. And so you want to take into account, the size this asset would be if it was in a game and you were able to walk up to it. Now let's take a look at how to correct texel density. The first thing we want to do when doing this is to create a new image. So I'm going to generate myself a new texture here. And I'm going to start by creating and I'm going to use pixels here because it's kind of the easiest way to go about doing this. I want to come up with a texel density that makes sense. And the way that you do this is by just creating a overarching resolution for what you're going to have in your game. So, for instance, 1 meter squared is equal to 2048 by 2048, obviously. So that gives us our texel density. So a 1 meter square, if you were to think of how big a meter is, that gives us a 2048 by 2048 resolution. So this is now something that we could adhere to when we work on every asset in the game, making sure that, well, okay, I know how big a meter is. You know, if I'm factoring in how big a can of Coke is compared to that, it gives me the resolution that I should have on the can of Coke. So what I'm going to do, I'll run with that. 1 meter by 1 meter is 2K. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create myself a chunk of this. So I'm going to make something that is 100 pixels by 100 pixels. I'm going to say okay. This 100 pixels by 100 pixels is going to serve as an image I'm going to use to kind of generate my texture density. So I'm just going to zoom in on this a little bit, and we'll zoom out a little bit here. And I'm going to generate kind of a grid on this that's going to allow me to figure out how big this is. So the way that I'm going to work, I need to create, and let me kind of plot out what I'm going to do here so you can kind of see where my head is at. So in the end, we need a 2048 by 2048. Okay, so that's the end texture we're going to make. To make this, I'm actually going to work on a 2000 by 2000 pixel image. And the reason for that is that we're using meters squared. And a meter doesn't go nicely in a 2048, but it does in a 2000. So I'm going to make a 2000 by 2000 image, and I'm going to scale it up to this once I'm done. Now, that's not going to give me the crystal clearest texture there is, but I need it to be more accurate to 1 meter squared. So we're going to work on this. So here, I know that 1 meter is going to equal 2,000 units. So what I can do is I can start divvying this up. So I know that half a meter, or 50 centimeters, is equal to 1,000 pixels. And going down even further, 25 centimeters is then going to be equal to 500 pixels. And I can go down yet even further. In fact, if we were to take this guy and bring it down to 10 centimeters, we could divide this by 5, and that will give us 200. So I now know that every 200 pixels is 10 centimeters, and every 100 pixels, the image I just made, is equal to 5 centimeters. So this is a 5 centimeter by 5 centimeter texture. And that's what I'm going to use to generate the other texture, the 2048 that I'm going to make. So this is 5 centimeters. So what I want to do here is create a 5 centimeter grid that I can use on here to kind of place out where things are going to go. So I've just on my other monitor here gone and Googled a 5 centimeter grid. I'll move this over so you can see it. So I just went and Googled 5 centimeter grid. I don't need paper. Google auto-filled that for me. So I just went and Googled 5 centimeter grid. And I really, in all honesty, I don't care what the actual size of it is. What I do care about is that I want a proper grid. So preferably something that I can use that is going to have 5 equal segments along it. And then maybe a ruler that I can put inside there as well. So I'm going to grab this one. All these things are watermarked, but that's okay. I don't care. So I'm going to copy this. I'll go into Photoshop here, and I'm going to paste it. Now, obviously, it's going to be humongous in here, so I'm going to go and just scale this down. trying to get it as quick as I can down to the right size. So I'm going to move the 0 side here over and bring this back out. Again, I want this to go perfectly from 0 to 5. So there. I'm at the 0, I'm at the 5, so I'm going to hit enter here. There is my 0 to 5. I can see it's a little bit blurry. Again, this was taking a fairly large image, and I'm making it fairly small. And so I'm going to try and just clean this up a little bit by just giving it a little bit more of a darker. I'm just going in with the marquee selection tool and selecting where the centimeter marks are. I'll put the 5 here as well, and I'm going to put the 0 on as well. And then just to make sure that they're all the same height, I'll trim it and trim it down here. Okay, we're going to go here and fill that in. So there, I've got my markers now a little bit clearer, so I can actually see where the 5 centimeters are. I'm just going to merge that down. Actually, that's a lie. I'm going to just keep it where it is. I'm going to bring it up to the top here, like that. And then what I want to do is I actually want to go through and maybe even take that little bit of black lines that I did here. And maybe I'll just actually continue these straight across. I didn't do anywhere near what I wanted it to. Let's go across here. So all I'm looking to do here is just grab a section of this that I can transform. There we go. I am locked in my transformation here. I don't want to scale it. Well, that's starting to work. Why is it crooked? I've got a new version of Photoshop, and I'm not happy with the change that it's done in the orientation here. So anyway, there is a 5 centimeter area here now. I could even break this down a little bit more. So there's half centimeter chunks if I want in here. I think what I'm going to do, let's go and adjust the, actually maybe what I'll do is duplicate this first. Let's duplicate it. I'm going to set my opacity to multiply, and I'm going to use that to just grab the halfway marks, which is about there. And then I'm going to adjust the opacity of this, just so that my halfway marks are lighter, like so. And then we're going to merge this down, and maybe we'll adjust the levels here a little bit. There's something like that. And I'm going to see if I can't drag this up here and down. There we go. So I'll just merge that down, and I'm going to create another layer, and I'll rotate this one on a 90-degree angle and move it up. Move it back down here. There we go. And again, I'll set this one to multiply as well. So what I've got here now is a 5 by 5 centimeter grid with the 2.5 areas here marked in this lighter color. And the only other thing that's kind of important here to remember is that this is 5 centimeters. So what I'm going to do is the absolute perimeter of this, which is just going to be a single pixel here. I'm going to go and mark this off with a different color. Okay, so there. I'm just grabbing a single pixel border all the way around the image. Something like that. And I'll just go fill this in with red. Okay, so like that. So there. So now every time you see a red line, and the red lines will be thicker, only because I actually have them doubled up, right, when this thing tiles. So red lines are 5 centimeter markers, black lines are every centimeter, and gray lines are every half centimeter. So there. So what I'm going to do now that I've got this kind of plotted out here, and I'm at 100 pixels by 100 pixels, I'm going to go to edit, and we are going to define a pattern. Okay, so I'm going to call this pattern 5cm grid. And I'll just do that. With that done, I can close this image, and we can now actually make our texture. So now I'm going to go make that 2000 by 2000 pixel image I mentioned. 2000 by 2000. And the thing with this 2000 by 2000 is that I will be able to fill it perfectly with what I just made. So here it is here. I'm going to go into my paint bucket, which is under my gradient tool. And there's my paint bucket. Now with the paint bucket, I'm going to switch from foreground color to pattern. In the pattern drop-down selection, I'll go to the very bottom, which should be, let me move this guy out of the way, the very bottom here, which is the last one I made, the 5 centimeter grid. Now what this is going to do is when I click here, it's going to fill my canvas with that grid. So now on a 2K texture, we actually can see every 5 centimeters with those red lines. Image size, and I'll bring this up to 48 by 48 and say okay. And I know this is going to garble up some of these lines, that they're not going to be as crystal clear as they were a moment ago. But it's not incredibly necessary to be that accurate. I just need it to be close enough that I can kind of gauge. So here's my texture. I'm going to go and save this. And we're going to go and put this in the Texel Density textures area here that I have. And we'll call this 2K. Which I decided was going to be 1 meter, and we'll do that. So now let's go take a look back in 3ds Max. What happens to these objects in terms of their UVs, when we start looking at how this was put together. Okay, so first things first. I need to make a new material here to place on these objects. So I'm going to go M to open my material editor. I'm going to go grab a material. I'm getting a tremendous amount of slowdown here. Why is Max lagging so much? Here we go. Bitmap. Once I have that bitmap, let's go kill this guy. I don't know how much resources that was taking, but we'll see if this helps. I'm trying to see if I can't find out where all my resources are going here. Max should not be slowing down like this. It is indeed 3ds Max. Yeah, I'm losing a lot of memory to Max. Anyway, it seems to be okay here now. So what I'm going to do, I'll select these two objects here, and I'm just going to go and apply the grid material that I just made. And we'll go and look at what that grid material looks like when applied here. So there it is there. One of the other things that I probably should have done while doing this is that this is just a completely repetitious pattern, which is giving me, I can see where every 5 centimeters are, but I can't actually see where the meter area is. And so what I'm going to do is just select the entirety of this thing, go to selection, we are going to modify, and we are going to contract. We'll contract it by 2 pixels and say okay. Make sure that that worked the way it was supposed to have. It did not. So let's go select and border. And I'll make a 2-pixel border selection. And just on a new layer here, we're going to make this blue on this other layer. So there, something like that. I'll just resave this image here. So the reason for this, this little blue area that I've made, is so that we can also track the 1 meter. So it's nice to see the 5 meters are red, but with a blue area now, we will also see where the 1 meter area is. So if I go look at this thing, I can see a couple of things are happening. First and foremost, my squares are not square on the rug, which is to be expected. The rug being rectangular, when I unwrapped it, I actually unwrapped it as 2 meters across by 1 meter up. And so being that it is a non-uniform shape, I unwrapped it non-uniformly. The can on the other side, on the other hand, was wrapped uniformly. And you can see here that why we're getting that mismatch, right? So you can see, again, 5 centimeters on the can is only that much across, but 5 centimeters on the rug was actually larger than the can was itself. So this is why things have gone a little haywire for me. So the idea now is to get these things, at least in terms of their UVs, to match. So what I'm going to do is, in my material editor, I'm going to duplicate this material just so that I can actually see what I'm supposed to be doing with it here. So I'm going to call this first one rug. Now the reason for that is that when I made this rug, I did make it 1 meter by 2 meters. And so that's how big the rug is. So this is how big a soda can would be on a rug of that dimensions. So if I go into my diffuse here, I know that in terms of the UVs, that this is going to be 1 by 2 in the tiling. And when I do that, we should get a pop here in the rug, like so. And I should now actually see my 1 by 2, which I am. I can see there's half, a whole one, and a half here. So that blue line is now indicating to me where my meter gaps are. So what I'm going to do is create another material. This will be the can. And I'm going to go into its diffuse color as well. And we will load this same image in. And we'll apply this to the can. I'll make sure I have only the can selected. And now I can assign this. So now what my goal to in this setup here to do is to start shrinking down the size of this texture so that the grids on these two things match. This is my currently accepted resolution of 2K for every square meter. This doesn't match that. So if I go into its diffuse and we start taking that 1 and reducing it. So we were to try 0.25, a quarter of the resolution it currently has. You can see we're getting closer, but the resolutions are still not the same. So the resolution of the texture for this thing is going to have to be smaller than a quarter of 2K. There's an 1/8. And at an 1/8, we are now getting a pretty unified texture resolution. Now, I can actually see on the can here that it's not unified on itself. So when this thing was unwrapped, it looks like the UVs were never unified. It looks like the sides of the can and the top of the can actually contain a different resolution. That is something, too, that needs to be fixed. if I go into my UV editor, hello, UV editor. There's a lot of little windows open here from Max. There we go. Let's go back. So here's the UV editor for the software here, and I can see exactly what's going on here. Is that this thing was never unified, and so if I grab it and I hit the unify, normalize, that'll square them up so that they actually are in relation to one another the right size. And so, yeah, I can see what I should have done in the first place. So if I actually go and scale all of this up here, and there's something like that, I can see how big I should have gone with this. Now, one of the reasons that I didn't unwrap it that way in the first place is that this obviously has a tremendous amount of wasted space, which is another problem all into its own. You know, the fix for this is to put something else in the texture with the can so that they share UVs and I can unwrap something else in here. But that would, if I convert this to an editable poly, fix my Texel Density issue. So I'm now looking at least while looking at this mesh, I'm now looking at something that is, in terms of the resolution, quite good. So the idea is to take your 2048 and get an eighth of its resolution. And that'll give you how big the texture of the can should have been in the first place to match the resolution of the rug here. And what that is, if I go and open these up in Photoshop, should be 256. So if I go, let's close that, and I'll open up my two textures that I have working here. So if I go into my textures and I grab the two images that I'm using, the rug and the can, we'll bring them into Photoshop. You'll see that they're both about, 1K in size. So the rug here is 1K, not even, it's 512 by 1K. And the can, if I bring it up, is actually 1024 by 1024. So I know to make these things unified that I have to make the can 1/8 the size of this 512, which is going to give it a really small texture resolution. We'll be at 64 pixels for the can. But that's also, this rug is not the right size either. It's too small. And so to fix that, again, if I'm doing two 2048 per square meter, the size of this rug would actually be 2K by 4K, which for something like this, that is such overkill, especially since when you look at this thing, it is a completely symmetrical pattern in both X and Y, which means when I do the UVs for this object, I'm actually going to unwrap it at 512 by 1024 for a quarter of this and set my UVs up accordingly so that I'm tiling. The can, on the other hand, should have been 256. So if I go to image size and I bring this down to 256 for the can and say OK, granted, I am losing a lot of resolution on this thing, but these two things now match one another. So if I go and save this guy and go back into Max here, that's going to give me a more unified UV resolution on this. And go and close. We'll leave that open for a moment. So I'll put this back on the can and this back on here, like so. And what's going on here now is a more unified resolution. So when you get up close, the blurry here should match this one. Again, this one is actually undersized right now. Remember that I just fixed the can. I didn't fix this one. So this is a 512 pixels across. And I know that 512 pixels should actually be, 1024 by 2048 for this chunk here. are, no, 512 by 1024 for that chunk there. So I would need to rescale this. And what that means, right, again, if I rescale this, it's not going to get clearer. There's only so far I can zoom into this thing before I lose detail. It means that this texture is actually no good, and I would have to do another pass on it. But that gives you a brief look at Texel Density and making sure that when you have a list of assets, that you don't have tiny little things that are very highly textured or very densely textured, and then, really big flat pixels on other things. Now, to give you kind of another real-world example of this here, I've got another older file of mine open, an old bike that I'd made. How does this apply to working on an asset like this when you have multiple material IDs? And the answer here is that it's kind of exactly the same. So I unwrap this thing. Again, we're only looking at my base color layers here on this bike. But when I unwrap this thing, I unwrapped it with various components that are made out of the same types of materials unwrapped together. So I have the tires here, unwrapped as part of a rubber collection and leather. So the tires, the seat, the handlebars, or at least the grips on the handlebars. There's actually some of my bike is missing here. I'm actually missing some components. But anyway, and then some of the wiring as well. All went into the same UVs. I then got these matte plastic areas here, which are, these two areas here and this area here, some of this stuff in here. This was all meant to be painted metal that had a kind of a matte finish on it. Everything that you see that's gray was actually a chrome area. And then I've got a couple of very high gloss paint job areas. Things like the fenders and the oil tank and the fairing here in the front. And so that's what my material IDs look like. Now, if I were to go and generate a new material for this bike over here, so this is my material currently that has all of these different components on it. If I go into this other one here and I show you kind of what I've done, we'll just select the entirety of the bike and assign it this new material. And on this new material, let's go and load up the grid we just made. So I'm going to do this from the desktop into Turner Made, into Texel Density, and then my textures. And here's the one that we just made, the 2K per 1 meter squared. And I'm just going to go up so that we can actually see this on the bike. And what you're going to see here is, again, a little bit of a mismatch in terms of the resolution of some components versus others. Now, some of these things, like the oil tank and the seat here, are really close to one another, as is the air filter and the fairing. You can see the fairing's a little bit larger. And then same thing down here. You can see the tires. I'm actually doing something a little bit different with the tires. The tread is tiled, but the sides are not. But I'm getting a little bit of a mismatch here. Now, what I did is I went through this process when I textured the bike, and wherever I ended up with something that was bigger like this, so this all these areas here, they actually got a lower resolution texture. So if I did 2K for the seat and tank, which were two separate materials, I would be able to go in and do a lower resolution one for these guys, unifying that kind of texture resolution a little bit. So what this means is that when you unwrap something, you want to normalize your UVs by selecting all of your material IDs together. And you want to do this before you actually finalize your packing. But you want to select them all together, and inside of the UV editor, normalize them. And you'll be able to see what my UVs look like here. Ooh, I wonder what that is. But anyway, this is my UVs here. And I have my different material IDs here. So material ID 1, this is the shiny metal components. Material ID 2, this is the, what am I looking at here? I think it's the chrome components. 3 is the alpha components. And you can see that it shares a material ID with 2. So 2 and 3 are actually on the same texture. I've just got them separated into different material IDs because one has transparency, the other does not. 4. This is the this is the shiny metal, this stuff here. And then 5 is the rubber or the matte metallic area. So what this does is you can see I'm far denser here in Material ID 4 or 5 than I am in 4. 4, you can see they're much larger. Well, this is going to get a texture that's only about half the resolution of this one, if not even smaller. So that when you see these things on the bike, you end up with a common pixel density across everything. Which is a really, really useful way of being able to do that. And making sure that you don't end up blowing out material IDs and you don't end up with, just a ridiculous amount of resolution on an asset, but just something that's going to work a little bit better inside of a game engine. So with that, that'll kind of bring this to an end. I hope that's been a much better way of understanding how Texel Density works inside of a game engine. And when you have an asset that has a lot of components like this, kind of the best approach to texturing this thing, making sure that you've got, a very clean, unified looking UVs on this thing so that you don't end up with a crazy high resolution little bit and then a very low resolution bit that's over here. That the entirety of your asset is, a singular resolution. The other thing that's really important is that, again, before you texture anything, take a look at what that asset is being used for. Take a look at, is this a third-person game or a first-person game? Again, looking at a bike like this, third person driving around in a game, I'm going to see this thing like this, if not smaller. If I go and show you another screen grab here, I'm just going to look up Days Gone since they just did motorcycles in their game. And we go look at Days Gone gameplay. And we were to go and find, hopefully, while he's on his bike, there we go. Let's do larger images here. Try and find something 1920 by 1080. Again, if I go and look for something where his bike is, in the game, hopefully something that's gameplay related. Getting into cinematics is a whole other can of worms. But there we go. So let's open this in a new tab. And again, this is 1920 by 1080. So again, when you look at how big that bike is on screen, we're looking at a far lower percentage of, screen real estate than when I'm looking at this thing in 3ds Max and I'm, trying to make sure that, it looks good, or when I have it in Substance Painter and I'm looking at how crisp or clean my textures are. When we go and look at the size of this bike in game, there's the top of the bike, there's the bottom of the bike, and there's the width of it. And again, this is 1920. Now that's obviously only if you're using a 1080 resolution. If you plan on your game being 4K, you can double these numbers. But still, you're not going to get a tremendous amount of pixels to play with. And, there's 1080 there. And so when you look at that, like the bike is barely even half of that in terms of its, proportion on the screen and height. And in terms of the 1920, like it's tiny. So, resolutions of textures play a very big component, the very big part of this when you're texturing something. It's okay to make a portfolio level resolution, but if the goal of making an asset is to get your foot in the door somewhere, to get yourself hired at a studio, studios want to see that you understand how game engines work and, how your assets adhere to whatever, project they're working on. So you don't want to blow out your texture resolution. You don't want to blow out your texture memory just because you think it looks good in Substance Painter. You want to make sure that inside of a game engine, when this thing is as close to the camera as you're ever going to see it, that it looks good there. So, anyway, I hope that has been helpful. I hope that has been entertaining and that you have learned something. I'm going to be putting this video in the free feeds here. This is going to be going up on YouTube and not on the Patreon page, only because I've had quite a few requests for this, and I want to make sure that it's something everybody can see, whether or not they are actually patrons of my site. Remember that you can become a patron by heading to patreon.com/TurnerMade, where I do little videos like this. I'm going to be changing the frequency here, just in order to make sure that I don't lose my mind trying to make these things. But I make videos like this all the time and post them there. So it's a place where you can go to kind of get a very good understanding of some of the more technical sides of what it is that we do in game development. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you next time.